Hello and welcome to The IR Thinker, where we explore the world of international relations one critical issue at a time. I'm Martin Zupko. In this episode, we examine the importance of decolonizing norms in international relations from a post-colonial perspective, understood not as a unified body of thought or a new ism in IR, but as a situated perspective. Today's guest is Professor Charlotte Epstein. Hello?
Hello, good morning, Martin.
Professor Epstein is based at the Tokyo College, University of Tokyo, whose work explores how language and political power co-constitute the modern international order. Bridging political theory, international relations, and intellectual history, she develops a genealogy of artifice to examine how modern forms of agency have shaped everything from environmental destruction to artificial intelligence. Her research also addresses identity, norms, and key concepts in IR theory. With over 3,000 citations according to Google Scholar, her work is widely read and valued for its depth of analysis by scholars around the world. Let's start with the first question, colonialism. All those terms are used widely, but sometimes we are missing the explanation. So when you describe the postcolonial perspective not as a unified theory, but as an epistemological intervention, what's your view? How to address this analytical perspective? And why you are not treating colonialism and postcolonialism as a school, but as a standpoint or a mode of critique?
Yes. So first of all, when we talk, let's start with the word postcolonial. Let's start there, because by postcolonial, really what we are talking about is a moment, right? It's a moment both in time, in other words, on the tail end, so to speak, of processes of colonization, right? We're sort of on the tail end of that, right? As well as a moment in space, as a moment in space. In other words, by that I mean, put it this way: if you take the international system, which is our object of analysis in IR, right, as IR scholars, right, what the post-colonial perspective does is that it realizes or pays attention to the fact that that system is, first of all, composed of a majority of post-colonial states, right? And that's not just a trivial fact. That's a profound realization that this international system was entirely shaped by processes of colonization. I'm saying two things here, two different things. One is that at this arrival point of this process, we are in an international system where the majority of states used to be colonies. That's the moment and place that I'm talking about, right? And I'm saying that these historical processes of colonization have profoundly shaped the international system that we've inherited today and within which states coexist in ways that we're used to analyzing. That's the first thing to say about the postcolonial, what I mean by postcolonial. Setting aside what we might call it for a minute. But for me, it's important to reckon with that simple fact, right? And that's why I like to begin by calling it a perspective, right? A perspective on that system that takes into account that fact, right? Maybe as the conversation unfolds, we can decide whether we want to call it a school or not. But I want to start with that simple fact.
I'd like to ask you about the motivation behind this perspective, because sometimes I read research papers and I read articles, and the authors, they're using post-colonial, but as I said at the beginning, they don't explain the perspective that much.
Yeah, I mean, again, let's. It may well be a school. I'm not necessarily really against calling it a school, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But what I'm insisting on is this notion of perspective or standpoint. I want to start there, because if you start from this simple fact that the majority of states in the international systems are former colonies, right? It's the big majority. The whole of Africa, that's the continent with the biggest number of states, right? All former colonies, right? The fact is that international relations theory and the discipline itself, right, practically never starts from their perspective. Okay, so the perspective of international relations theory, right, the perspective of the discipline, has always started from Europe and the United States. Okay, it starts from there and it looks at the rest of the world. Okay, a postcolonial perspective flips that on its head and say, what does the same system look like if you take the perspective of a former colonized state, the state that's on the receiving end of the processes of colonization that have shaped the international system, right? So it really is that you situate yourself in the non-central parts of the international system, the ex-centered parts of the international system. And I know you have in one of your questions, you're asking me, why am I including, this seems to include, if you like, not necessarily former colonies. In particular, in my own work, I give the example of Japan, right, which was not a colony. Or in the book, the bigger book out of which my chapter comes, there's the example of Turkey. Well, what Japan and Turkey share with all these former colonies as well is being ex-centered places in the discipline of international relations, ex-centered in the practice generally of international relations policymaking, but also in theory as well, right? We rarely start from that point of view. It's always implicitly or explicitly a Eurocentric or North American-centric point of view from which questions are asked. So to give you an example, the one that I know you want to talk about, norm diffusion, right? The very concept of norm diffusion doesn't even seem to realize that it has built into itself the idea that it is diffused from somewhere, generally a civilized European country or a North American country, to a non-civilized, non-European country. So norm diffusion in and of itself has built in this Eurocentricity, the fact that the center is implied to always be Europe and North America and going towards the rest. So the point of view that we're talking about, situating it here, is flipping that on its head and asking the questions from the other end of the lens, so to speak.
And then we have another thing, and that's the condition of position rather than historical experience alone, regarding the postcolonialism. How to implement this idea, or how do you work with that idea?
Yeah, the relevant perspective here is, or the person who's coined something very helpful is feminist scholar Donna Haraway is her name, who coined the term a situated perspective, right? And she, by situated perspective, what she was trying to capture is a standpoint for theorizing and for doing thinking, right? That is explicit about the place from which it is theorizing. In the example I gave earlier with norm diffusion, right? It's never made explicit that it's diffused from a particular point, the center, to a periphery, right? That implied center that's never rendered visible, if you like, is unmarked, unsituated, made invisible, right? It's unmarked and situated, made invisible. And what she has convincingly shown is that point of view, unmarked, invisible, is actually the point of view of God epistemologically, right? It doesn't have to be marked, but it's in the feminists have shown as well. It's also the point of view of the white male. That it doesn't have to be marked. It's implicitly the homogenizing viewpoint on the world, right? So against this unmarkedness, which is a claim to power, which is a site of power, right? If you hold the unmarked position, the one that nobody has to even that you don't have to legitimize, you're de facto you're holding the position of authority. You don't have to legitimize it. Against that, if you like, against the unmarked position, the postcolonial perspective wants to have a situated perspective, one that owns its own situatedness, right? That doesn't have this claim to being unmarked, because otherwise it's playing the same power relations as the approaches that it's critiquing, as the hegemonic approaches that it's critiquing, right? But that's locating itself that's explicitly located.
I think that was a great explanation, because, as I said, that's very important to specify the position when we are researching and we are publishing the papers.
Just throw in an additional element here in terms of, it happens to be something I'm reading at the moment. So I'm in Japan, right? about the importance of marking your own position as a researcher, right? I'm in Japan, and there's a very famous book in Japan. When you arrive here, everyone says it's the reference point, which is a book called The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. It's a famous classic of anthropology, right? And it's one of the first Western works on Japan, right?
Great.
Except it's commissioned and produced by the Department Defense, Department of Defense, the US Department of Defense, who commissioned this anthropologist as it was occupying Japan, right, to produce knowledge about Japan. That's a very problematic position for knowledge production about a country that you're occupying, you know, what's the quality of this knowledge, you know, a knowledge that is very clearly serving an operation of power. The US is ruling Japan at that particular point, right? So this goes to show, and this, by the way, that also speaks to why I'm extending these categories of colonial and postcolonial. You can see that this is a similar position to a sort of colonial occupation. But this goes to the importance of situating yourself, of being honest about your own situatedness for ethical purposes, right? And also giving the reader a chance to decide what they think about the veracity of what you're saying as a result of this situatedness. You know, how much can we really fully take on board her statements about Japan?
Absolutely. And I think that reflexivity is crucial and often missing, unfortunately, in many reports and analysis, especially when you have those highly geopolitically controversial issues or some sensitive issues and topics that basically IR is about, because we are always speaking about something which is sensitive to either this or that part or actor. So that's quite important to know. So let's go to the norms. You suggest that norms are not merely regulatory, but disciplinary, operating through internalization rather than coercion. How does this Foucauldian understanding fundamentally alter how we should study norm diffusion and compliance?
Yeah. I think, if I might again begin by taking a step back here into what is the business that I think I'm engaged in. The norms, I don't need to tell you that, but it's still good to remind ourselves, you know, norms are ordering mechanisms in the international system, right? And we tend to be attached to norms because we've got if we're not talking about norms, we're talking about interests and interest maximizing, and norms are a more civilized way of interacting in the international system. So they are ordering mechanisms, and they're studied as that. And I might even say, doing an enterprise of critiquing norms at the moment is probably a bit delicate, because you know, I find my own attachment to norms increasing in a Trumpian world. You know, like, it would be rather good if norms were, you know, valorized at the moment. So anyways, setting that aside. Nevertheless, there's two ways in which we can look at norms. One is how they work, right? So how they are diffused in the international system, how they make states align on, how they help states cooperate, how they help states align their behaviors on one another, how they help enterprises of that kind. What else do? They help. They reduce transaction costs. They enable collective projects and so forth and so on. They are essential. The one place in which one should always start, I think, with norms is a place where they're defining is for environmental issues, right? One has to agree that when the norm of combating climate change, that's a norm, and only through a norm can climate change actually be combated in an international system of sovereign states. So how norms work, how they can work better, how they are contested, that's a whole area of research, specifically associated with constructivism, as you know, and so forth. Or second approach, which is mine, you can take a step back, right, and ask yourselves, how these norms came about in the first place, right? Not how they function, but how they came about in the first place. What power relations enabled them to come about, and what particular regimes of truth, right, do they hold in place, or do they impose, right? And those are very different questions, and they require different tools for thinking about the same stuff. So I'm getting towards what you're asking me, but they require different tools, right? They require, because when you kind of just throw yourself into, I get the first approach, I guess I'd call it ontological, right? As you just throw yourself into sort of how norms work and how they exist in the international system. There, yeah, you're just in the business of looking at, yeah, the tools there are conceptual tools, I mean, are diffusion, contestation. You look at things like norm entrepreneurs, particular kinds of actors, and you need tools that help you understand, conceptual tools that help you understand how the workings function more or less well. When you want to pause and ask yourself, wait a minute, how did these norms come about in the first place? You are already starting to look at an international system, as I said before. If you've already put on that postcolonial perspective, you're looking at an international system that was shaped by processes of colonization and the power relations that go with that, right? So there, your question about the emergence of a particular norm is always going to be in relation to broader relations of power in the international system. And there, yeah, like I said, you need different kinds of tools. The ones that I've tried to develop is, in particular, rather than just looking at the idea at norms, you look at at normation, right, or the emergence of norms in a particular issue area, how a particular norm started regulating and defining a particular issue area, right, or norming, therefore normation, right? To talk a bit concretely, the issue area that I used to work on quite a lot, or still work on, is the politics of whaling, right? And the interesting thing about the politics of whaling is how you had an issue area that was entirely regulated by one norm, which was the norm of whaling. Whaling was one whaled, right? And so the countries came together as whaling countries and figured out how to control coordinate their whaling with one another so that they didn't over whale and kill the stock, etc. And that was the point of coming together and cooperating. And that was the point of the normative behavior, and it was normative behavior. And then that issue area got entirely renormed in the opposite direction by a different set of actors, such that the regulatory norm was anti-whaling. That whaling was a bad thing, and saving whales was really the thing to do with whales, and the thing to do, and the reason for states cooperating with one another was for saving whales rather than for whaling. Well, so faced with that, two things I want to say. My question is, how did that come about? How did that renorming come about, right? And this is something I analyzed in my first book, called The Power of Words in International Relations: Birth of an Anti-Whaling Discourse. And if you like, my argument in that book is that I show that how it's a part of a whole discourse on whales, right? That entirely reorganized the norms around whaling from pro-whaling to anti-whaling. But what I looked at, what I'm getting at is, rather than just looking at how states did it, how states respond, how states behave normatively, so to speak, I look at how this new discourse came about that forced states, or you could never really force states, but according to which, along which states aligned themselves, upon which states align themselves, right? And so I kept the question of power in the picture, is what I'm saying, and power relations. Well, actually, in my case, it was both types of power, because I suggest it's discursive power, which was still understudied in IR when the book came out, right? But also power relations, right? And in that space in particular, what's remarkable about that space is that an unusual actor was particularly powerful, which is NGOs. But in terms of to answer your question about disciplining, norming does actually become, when seen from this perspective, does become coercive and disciplinarian. In particular, in the country where I am at the moment, the anti-whaling norm was really experienced as coercive and disciplinarian, right? And in a way that it never managed to take hold.
How have you been received in Japan when you wrote about that topic, which is very, very big and sensitive topic in Japan? Did you have any meetings with the policy makers or academics that you wrote that book and they like it?
Well, so I mean, at the time when I did the research for my book, I had to meet with the policymakers and NGOs, but I did that for all the big states, all the relevant states that were involved in the whaling space, right? So, or in the anti-whaling space. So yes, I did that as part of my job, so to speak. What was interesting about that though is that when I did meet with the Japanese, specifically in the context of the annual meeting of the International Whaling Commission, I found myself attacked by the Western NGOs simply for talking to the Japanese, who suggested that I was being bought out by the Japanese, literally for doing my job, right, and going to speak to them. Interestingly enough, when the book came out and when I was done, I don't know if it was a lost in translation, but it didn't get very. I didn't have the impact that I was hoping it might have in Japan. It was not. No, I can't say that it was particularly picked up. If anything, it was translated and picked up in China. I think that's because of the theoretical contribution of the book, which is discourse analysis and discursive power.
I'd like to close this first half of the interview by the last question, and it's to clarify, why do norms rather than concepts like power of security exposed to discipline colonial inheritance so sharply? Because you argue that the norms are more revealing for decolonizing international relations than concepts.
I mean, I want to say, so if I am to develop a postcolonial, in a postcolonial perspective, ideally one ought to revisit all of IR's concepts and see whether they need to be rectified, right? So I would say this epistemological work, I think, needs to look at all of our tools that we're working with, to see if they might need some rethinking, right? So, but then maybe some of them are okay. I mean, power is straightforward. It's self-explanatory, and security, well, is a whole other world. But there is something specific about norms. You're quite correct in this perspective, which is a tension between, on the one hand, the pretension in international norms, right, to universality, right, the claim to be something that's universal, that works equally for all states, right, on the one hand, as opposed to the deeply localized origins that they always have on the other. In other words, that norms are always invented, as I said, generally in Europe, right, in a kind of Eurocentric position, right? They always come from that particular place, right? And then they're projected onto in the history of IR, they projected onto the rest of the world, and as universal, as global, as applying to everyone. So there's this fundamental tension in the very idea of norms. And there's and it's built into the way norms work. Norms claim to be universal. That's their trick, so to speak, and they're therefore actively hiding their local origins, and that's a source of a lot of the hiding of the initial power relations that are at play in norms. To give a specific example, the norm of self-determination, right, which is, UN Charter business. It's one we're all fairly common with in the UN system. Well, the norm of self-determination is a fascinating one. Adam Getachov wrote a very nice book called what's your book called? Let me just find Worlding After Empire, in which she shows how the norm of self-determination was first projected at the international level, in the international system, through the League of Nations, right? That's the moment that it became a kind of universal thing, right? Except that it turns out, upon closer inspection, again, if you flip this perspective, no longer looking at the world from the point of view of the United States or Europe, the makers of the norm, but from the perspective of a country such as Ethiopia, right, who was included in the League of Nations. Ethiopia and Liberia were the two African countries that were included in the League of Nations, right? But it turns out that the League of Nations was based on this universal norm, self-determination. In actual fact, it was applied very, very differentially in relation to Ethiopia or Liberia compared to all the other countries of the League, right? It was a completely racialized. There was a racialized hierarchy within the League of Nations that was hidden by the norm of self-determination. So that, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, the League of Nations was supposed to say something, norm of self-determination and all that. Well, they didn't say very much, And she shows how the League of Nations, how the other countries were constantly intervening within Ethiopia in the name of Ethiopia's not quite being capable of being a sovereign state. And so that's a good example of a norm that's supposed to be universal, right? That's coming from one particular part of the international system projected onto the rest, and not applied universally, that hides the traces of the racial hierarchies that are built into it.
That reminds me a little bit 9/11, when President Bush was defending the torture, saying that Al-Qaeda is not a signing party of Geneva Convention. So even we all knew that it's torturing and it's not something that should have been happening, but still the norm was either from one perspective ignored, from the other perspective was cleverly bypassed. So right. I think this is very, very good example that you also pointed out. I would like to add another layer to our discussion, and that's I noticed that you are shifting the critique from norms as practices to norms as epistemological categories. And I was thinking, why is that shift important to properly understand post-colonial critique?
Yeah, so that's part of the. It's another way of saying what I was getting at earlier, meaning that when you're looking at the practices and how the norms work, it's what I call this ontological level of the discipline, where you're looking at the business of norms working there. Whereas when you're looking at norms as epistemological categories, it's that step back that I call epistemological gesture. One way of showing to you why it's at the heart of what's happening in the postcolonial is if you like the difference between the anti-colonial and the postcolonial. This is based on an analysis by David Scott, who makes a very convincing point about this. Which is that the anti-colonial moment was the moment of rejection, right, of these colonial dominations, right? So it was a moment of rejection, so that's what led, by the way, to all these so many post-colonial states that we have today, which is sort of the anti-colonial struggles that yielded these new states. But the post-colonial, as opposed to the anti-colonial moment, is this moment where you're not just rejecting. But you're sort of turning back on yourself to look at what categories did you in fact inherit from the original moments of colonialism. What epistemological categories, right? What tools, intellectual tools did you inherit, and do you continue to perpetuate without realizing it? So the postcolonial, in this sense, is fundamentally this moment of turning back on yourself or taking a step back. And looking at where you stand. It's that epistemological work, if you like. It's at the heart of the postcolonial, and that's what I'm suggesting taking to norms.
What would be the example, for instance, a simple epistemological category?
No. We can. I mean, human rights is a good example of epistemological categories. Yes, because, for example, if you take the cluster of practices around human rights and say responsibility to protect, right, which is they're bound up together, and in practice they have been a big area of state intervention and foreign policy and all that, right? That's a good example where this epistemological kind of like, wait a minute, stop, take a step back, have a look at what's going on here, has been done quite convincingly. For example, someone called Anne Orford, she's an international lawyer, but has made this postcolonial gesture to show how actually in the practices of around responsibility to protect, right? Something which sure looks like a good thing, which is the idea of sovereignty as responsibility, in practice has been used to further and reproduce the same racialized hierarchies that we were talking about earlier, meaning that they have been used to intervene in some particular states, generally racialized states, and not others, that they are used very selectively in ways that were already prepared for by racial hierarchies, right? And that she traces how they were literally the interventions have only happened in those places that were laid out by those racial hierarchies. So that's an important area where something, I mean, and that's what's tricky with norms is that, again, they're a good thing, right? I mean, in the international system, it's a real problem that you only have power and interests as an alternative, you know? We want to be able to cooperate. But that's an example of something where without doing the work, you end up reproducing the same century-old racialized hierarchies. Yeah.
We mentioned situated perspectives as one of the main one of the main concept, but you might have some critique that this might fall or collapse to relativism or abandoning theory building. How do you respond to that?
So first of all, the assumption behind behind such a question, or the worry behind such a question, is that theory building has to take that unsituated perspective. This is not at all the case. Situated perspectives is completely compatible with developing concepts that you need to be able to analyze the world, and therefore I call that theory building, right? When you're developing a conceptual toolkit to be able to ask questions, investigate them, well, you're in good stead for theory building. But it's not a theory building in the way that the classical scientific, well, the old science, the old white male science used to be, which is the godlike perspective. As an absolute perspective. It's one that pays attention instead to where questions are being asked from. Like I said, that book on Japan, it's quite important to ask where that question is being asked from, right? That's one thing. And then the fear of relativism is one that I don't really understand, because one always has to be able to be critical, and I think and that is as old as science itself, right? Being skeptical, being critical, interrogating the findings, and so forth, etc. There's always some fear that it's going to end into relativism, but I think it's a false worry.
I think we can come back to Churchill, who said that the only statistics he believes is the ones that he basically manipulated. So that's also sort of relativism in a way that whatever information you receive or the facts you are reading about can be taken from that relativism point of view.
When you're doing this critical work that we've been talking about, right, of deconstructing the categories and paying attention to where they've come from, etc., you're actually always doing it in the name of some pretty serious absolutes, which is what's right and what's wrong, and what's true and what did and didn't happen. So long, when that deconstructive work is tethered to such values, there's no danger of relativism. Churchill is we're talking about cynicism. We're talking about someone who's using power and who's exercising power. So that's more of a cynicism. Yeah, but there's no danger of relativism when what you're deconstructing is in the name of some serious values.
How important is experience when we research norms, when we are writing about contestation, about forming the norms or diffusing the norms?
So experience is a slippy category, right? And I know it can raise some concerns. It has raised some concerns in the discipline of history. There's been a long debate around the idea of experience, and in particular amongst the Marxists. And I don't know if this is familiar to you, but this is where I had to start thinking about this, because I encountered this debate in history that took place between the Marxists, who were appealing to some notion of working class experience or some working class common sense to contest. I can't remember what it is they were contesting, but it was in that context they started using the idea of a working class experience of being alienated, I think, from capitalism. That was the context. And then against that, someone like Joan Scott, the feminist Joan Scott, came around and said, wait a minute, what experience are you talking about? Working class experience. That working class experience that you're talking about, that you're assuming is everyone's experience. Can you see that even when you're talking about it, you're talking about a male experience and assuming that it's a general experience. Again, that unmarked perspective of male, that's an example of it, right? Experience is always mediated and culturally constructed and through language, right? So it's a social construct. So we can't have a raw access to experience. And in fact, any reference to experience is always suspect and tends to hide an ideological agenda, right? So that was what I walked into when I said, can we recover the notion of experience? And I'm using it in the specific sense of tying it up with the idea of situatedness. I'm using it specifically with the idea of turning around the point of view and starting, from Ethiopia or from Japan, and looking at the international system. So the experience of Ethiopia, the experience of what it means to be the state into which you have all these white experts who are constantly intervening in your country in the name of your belonging to the League of Nations, right? That's what I'm talking about, as situatedness, right? So Spivak, the postcolonial scholar, talks about a strategic use of the notion of experience, right? She's recalled she writes about the subaltern, right? So the colonized, the dominated, right? And doubly so in her case, women and women of color, right? But she still wants to start from their experience, from that point of view of the subjugated, of the subaltern, and to write back from that position, right? So she's not naive. She's about a kind of raw access to experience, but it's a strategic use of the notion of experience to be able to do the epistemological work we were talking about, the work of critique and cleaning up these norms and look at these categories, all the categories, and seeing what they carry with them.
To understand experience in a better perspective, what are the best sources for you as a researcher? Is it the text? Is it discourse? Is it pictures or historical sort of books? What do you use? Because I think that's also quite an interesting topic, how to understand experience. Because we can say, oh, I understand this. And then you are meeting with someone and says like, oh, really? So what would be that position that a researcher or younger researcher should take to understand experience in a proper way?
I guess so. There's maybe there's two ways you can answer that. First of all, this is where I think discourses are a good place to start. Particular discourses, because discourses are interpersonal, right? It's not just one person's thing. You need to be able to get out of the one person's experience, because that's what's hard to use in research terms. So when you start to have a discourse, that means that it's circulating, it's operative, it's functioning, it's linking things together. So it's the beginning of a place where you can look at experience. There's quite a different way of looking at experience, which actually is in postcolonial scholarship, which is to look at experiences of embodiment, and because what does it mean to have a black body in a white world? Well, here the starting point. So that's quite a different starting point, but it does illustrate my point. The starting point is invariably Frantz Fanon, right? And to show you how important experience, how you can't do away with experience, right? Fanon has this extraordinary description of his own experience, in particular sitting in a train in France. He's sitting in a train, sitting opposite a little boy and his mother, and he can see that the little boy is afraid of him, right? Afraid of him, afraid of his blackness, afraid of what he represents, right? And this is how he's encountering the experience of a racist discourse that necessarily represents the black man as scary, as as dangerous, and so forth. We flipped around the lens, like we talked about earlier, and standing from Fanon's own point of view, sitting in the train, right? He describes that experience, and from that experience, he devises this expression, which is so useful to many of us, which is the idea of black faces, white masks, right? The title of which is also the title of his book. But where he shows how the being black in the world means that you are never fully going to be able to wear the mask that you need. Let's transfer it to the international system to sit at the table in the international system, right? So if you're Ethiopia, in the League of Nations, you can never quite wear the mask, the trappings that you need to sit at the table in the international system. But by the way, we don't need to look back at the 1930s. Trump the other day, who said that Somalia was not a country, right? This is a beautiful echo of these racialized hierarchies that have not gone away. Somalia is not a country. And he said that at the time when Somalia is presiding the United Nations Security Council. It couldn't be more insulting. And he said, not a country, right? It will never wear the white mask needed to qualify as a sovereign country.
Let me go to the next topic, and that's you introduce norming and renorming based on Foucault's research to move beyond diffusion-centered models. Why is that, and what do you want to achieve by this?
I want to find a way find a way of stepping out of the specific norm that you're focusing on, right? And look and return to that awareness, that space where that norm is ordaining wasn't necessary. How would it look before the norm or without the norm? Or indeed, another way of bringing that into focus is when we have spaces that have been renormed, where the norm has completely changed, like in the case of whaling and anti-whaling. But I can give you another example, which I was thinking about before we had this conversation. The environmental space, right, which is probably one of the most prone to analyzing in terms of norms, and impossible to analyze without norms. I was thinking about that before we started having this conversation. And yet, even that space is full of power relations or if you like, taken for granted that I'm trying to untake for granted with these concepts, right? In the environmental space, the dominant norm is climate change, right? Undeniably. That comes at the cost of many other norms that could have taken the central space in that space. For example, biodiversity protection is my favorite one, right? It used to be the case that in 1992, when the big environmental conventions were put on the table, you had side by side desertification, climate change, and biodiversity. The one that became the dominant norm, that yielded dominant norm, was climate change. biodiversity, desertification has all but disappeared. That was the one that African countries cared about. And biodiversity has largely fallen to the wayside. Here you have a space where these three norms could have coexisted, right? And where one has become mega dominant and the other ones have disappeared. You take the concepts of norming and renorming, you look at how that space was initially normed in the first place, right? And ask yourselves the questions, what happened to the other norms? And could it be renormed in another way? So it's a way of creating some dynamism around the space that you're studying with norms, and not taking at face value these norms. Also because by taking them at face value, you're often not seeing the power relations that are keeping them in place.
So basically, in other words, we can say that this approach can be used to examine all the norms, because we can take the perspective of particular region or country, or maybe
Correct.
some other attitude, and we can examine the norms based on your concept of norming, how the norm was normed or implemented, and then
Yes.
we can say renorming, which means to remove that to remove the colonial heritage of that norm and maybe make it better.
Yes.
That
yes.
would be my logical sort of assumption when we speak about this concept.
Well, yes. I mean, so for example, let's take self-determination, right? Self-determination, as I showed you earlier, or has been shown by Adam Getachew, was applied very selectively, right? But you don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater. Everybody wants self-determination, right? So you need to separate out sort of I had in mind about normalization and the Foucauldian ideas of discipline. What Foucault showed very clearly, and which has been forgotten, I think, by our IR scholars, is the idea that norms are very constraining, right? And to become aware that they're very constraining, right? So colonial people, colonized people know that better than anyone, just how constraining norms are, right? But it's this idea of becoming aware of the constraining norms are always the product of a certain normalization, right? They're the product of a certain normalization, right? Which was disciplining and constraining. I'll leave it at that.
You also argue that norm research was successful, or it is successful, and that's also a problem. On the other hand, how we can understand this statement? What's the problem with success in research?
I mean, the biggest problem is that you become complacent in several ways. First of all, you stop making the effort to speak to alternative approaches. And that for me is the most serious condemnation, so to speak, right? You stop making the effort for when your area is so established, right? And there's been so many people doing stuff on norms, etc. You no longer even bother to say so what or why this is interesting or why it's interesting to other approaches. And that's a real impoverishment. It's a real impoverishment. And Ole Weaver and myself have just published an article on called "The Turn to Turns in International Relations," which is generating quite a bit of controversy and has already generated quite a bit of controversy, because we are critiquing the tendency of the discipline at the moment to do turns, like to turn to visuals, there's a multiplication of endless number of turns in the discipline. So from a sociology of knowledge perspective, we take a step back and look at the way the discipline has evolved to this point where it's multiplying turns to practices, to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we try and argue that there's a way in which every turn basically stops talking to the turns that precede it and becomes more and more insulated, insulary. And that would be the reason why I wouldn't really want a kind of postcolonialism to develop. Is that I think that this work is effective when it's always latched onto, like in the same way that my approach, what I'm taking, I'm latching onto the concept of norms, right? And doing the work like that. It's less interesting when it goes off and does its own little insulary stuff. And that's generally what tends to happen when it becomes successful. So I'm saying several things. I'm saying that success tends to, people become tempted to form their own school or turn or thing, right? And then I think they get a bit lazy and they lose sight of the broader discipline and frankly of the world.
The last question for today's interview. When you research norms and you basically go for the origin of the norms, for colonial heritage, and then you try to get that post-colonial perspective, there are certainly many challenges, especially for young researchers. Which challenges would you identify as the most challenging?
The hardest thing is to untake for granted that which is taken for granted. To sort of find that way of edging yourself out of things as they are, right? And to begin to ask questions about all these taken for granted norms, like human rights, like in whichever environmental norm it may be, right? So to find a way of, and that generally means, so there are some specific questions you can ask yourself there. Do the genealogy, where did this norm come from, right? What particular power relations did they come out of? What particular political contestations? What were the fights, the specific fights that they were as a resolution of, right? Because a norm always looks like a resolution of an arrival point. But what particular fights, what particular contestations over them? You can look for the contestations over the terms themselves. That's generally a good place to start. That's why I'm a discourse scholar. How are the terms fought over, right? What were different definitions of the terms given? You need to find those places of contestations that the norm as it looks like today has completely smoothed over, but that are there in its past. Look for where there's some smoke, so to speak.
Professor Epstein, many thanks for your insights, for sharing your research with us. I think this discussion was just excellent because it opened many avenues for research and for thinking more deeply about the norms. Because as you said, we take many things for granted, especially in the European Union, United Kingdom, and and Northern America. But the majority of the world is actually out of this. And when I speak with the scholars from Africa, from Asian countries, Middle East, they usually tell me, look, you think that human rights is automatically everywhere. But the majority of the world doesn't have that. And I think this is also a very important aspect to include when we're researching norms and the post-colonial perspective about the norms. So again, many thanks for being on the IR Thinker.
My pleasure, Martin.